What's going on YouTube and Diablo 4 fans? It's Lanfear here from Lanfear's Diablo 4. Welcome back to the channel. So let's jump right into what today's video is going to be about. And we are going to be looking at a theory crafted build guide for a sorcerer or sorceress in Diablo 4, and we are specifically going to be focusing on the core skill of Frozen Orb, and basically we're going to be looking at a frost or ice version of a sorcerer, and this will be looking at Frozen Orb as your main skill. So I played this build in the Server Slam recently, as well as a couple others, just theory crafting and testing out a couple builds, and I thought there's a lot of nice synergies in the build, as well as it just generally being quite a strong, powerful, and versatile build. So we're going to have a look at, firstly, what would be a fully spec'd and fully skill synergized version of this build, and what you would maybe consider late or end game. And I mean, because we aren't fully equipped yet to really grasp what the end game is, it is very much theory, but I think they're looking at other builds that are out there at the moment and crafting my own around that. I think that this will definitely hold its own in the late game and in the end game. And I think that generally the sorceress or sorcerer is a very versatile hero or class in Diablo 4. It has a lot of good damage mitigation in terms of its shields, and it also pumps out a lot of damage, and being ranged means you can avoid a lot of damage taken. So overall, I think the sorcerer or sorceress is a great starting character getting yourself into Diablo 4, and it will also just be a general good all-rounder. I don't think it's going to top the damage charts, but it will be up there, and it will definitely be sort of middle to top tier in terms of its toughness and survivability. So with that being said, let's jump right into what this build is going to look like. So we are using the d4builds.gg site here to build this, and thank you very much for them and what they've done to allow us to do this. And we are looking at my build for the pure Frozen Orb Sorcerer, as I've called it. So to start off here on the skill tree, we are going to be picking up Frostbolt as opposed to Spark or Firebolt or Arclash as our basic skill, and we're going to put 1 point into its synergy, which is Enhance Frostbolt, and that's just to give us enough points to get to our core skills here. And for our core skills, like the name suggests, we are going to be using Frozen Orb. So Frozen Orb is a ranged projectile that shoots out many other frozen shards that pierce, and it explodes at the end, dealing extra damage. And this skill is very powerful and very fun to play with. So as soon as possible, we are going to max out Frozen Orb for this build, and along the way get the other synergistic skills as well. So here we have Enhanced Frozen Orb, and that when you cast it above 50 mana, it deals extra damage at its explosion. And then the last synergy for this is Frozen Orb's explosion has a good chance, a 25% chance, to make enemies vulnerable, and it always makes frozen enemies vulnerable. So with these synergies, Frozen Orb becomes a very powerful skill, and one that will carry us all the way through to the end game. So along that path, we're also going to be taking quite a few defensive skills here. Because we're going to be doing a lot of damage, we also need to be able to survive, and that's where using all these defensive skills and focusing on Frozen Orb comes into play. So before we do this offshoot on the core skill tree, we'll probably head down here to our defensive skills, where we will put 1 point into Flame Shield, which is a very strong shield that also makes you immune for 2 seconds, and with its synergies, it will also give you movement speed when you hit it, and it will also heal you for some of your missing life. So you'll pick up Flame Shield as well as its synergies, and then it's just a general all-round almost must-pick for most Sorcerer builds, in my opinion. It's such a powerful skill and such a powerful defensive skill that I think almost all Sorcerers will use this. So we'll pick up Flame Shield, we'll also pick up Teleport. Now, you can maybe find something, an item with a rank into Teleport, and you won't need to put hard points into it, but if you don't, you'll put a hard rank into Teleport, and for its synergies, you will do Enhanced Teleport, which decreases the cooldown by 0.5 seconds for every enemy you hit with your teleport. So that will help every now and again when you teleport into the fray and hit a few enemies with that. So next we will get the Shimmering Teleport synergy, and that will give you damage reduction for 5 seconds after teleporting, which also makes teleport not only a mobility and general utility skill, but it also adds defense to it by giving you that damage reduction. Then we'll also pick up 1 rank into Ice Armor, which is a good barrier shield, and that absorbs quite a bit of damage and gives you an extra line of defense. And it also, with its synergy, will also generate a bit more mana whilst active. So that is something that's quite important for this build, is generating as much mana as possible, and we will get into that just now. Then Frost Nova, carrying on with the theme of a frost-based sorcerer. This is a great utility skill and defensive skill by freezing the enemies around you, and this will also provide you more damage with some of the other synergies you pick up later on. And if we pick the 2 synergies here for Frost Nova, when we kill enemies with Frost Novas, it won't be that often, but you reduce the cooldown, and then Frost Novas also makes enemies vulnerable, which will help us with our Frozen Orb and our other damaging skills. So you will try as soon as possible to get 1 point into each of these defensive skills, as well as maxing out your Frozen Orb and its synergies. Then from there, with basically the points focusing, the skill points that you focus into your core skills and your defensive skills, you should hopefully be getting close towards your ultimate and then your passive as well. So once you've sort of got some of these synergies and these points, as well as maxed out your core skill in Frozen Orb, you will be looking at picking up your Deep Freeze ultimate and then your Avalanche passive. But we'll get to that just now. So once we have invested here in this defensive skill tree, we will start looking at heading down, and we will also look at these skills, part of your conjuration skills. And one really powerful one is Precision Magic. With 3 ranks into this, your lucky hit chance is increased by 15%. So that is a really useful investment of 3 skill points. Then just off from there is Align the Elements, which will gain you 3% damage reduction against elites with 3 points or ranks put into this, and that's for each second you haven't taken damage from an elite. So when you're fighting against trash, you get a lot of damage reduction just against general trash mobs, and this helps a lot in general gameplay. And it also gives us access to these 2 skills, which is Mana Shield, which every time you spend 100 mana, you gain 15% damage reduction for 5 seconds, and spamming Frozen Orb, you will be spending a lot of mana, so this will proc quite often, and you'll get quite a lot of defense from that. Then Protection is using a cooldown, which we have quite a few of in Flame Shield, your Ice Armor, your Teleport, and Frost Nova. You will gain 30% of your maximum life as a barrier for 2 seconds. So with these other defensive skills, this little passive really boosts your defenses quite well, which will be really important in the late game for dealing out as much damage as possible while still being tanky and strong. So that's it for the conjuration tree here, and we won't be looking at ice blades or hydra, lightning spear, anything like that. We are just focusing on these mentioned passives that we have here. So moving on to your mastery skills, we won't be picking up Blizzard, although you can experiment with this in the early to mid game. It does add quite a lot of utility as well as damage to the build, so for mid game or early game this is an option. But for the end game spec, you will want 3 hard ranks into your Icy Veil, and this will give your barriers 15% increased duration with 3 ranks in there, as well as Snap Freeze, which means your lucky hit with frost skills have up to a 9% chance to instantly freeze enemies, and that will help your crowd control and your general gameplay quite nicely. So Snap Freeze with 3 ranks into that is quite important. So moving on to our ultimate skill tree here, or node of the skill tree, we will want to be taking the Deep Freeze ultimate. So this is a very nice utility-based ultimate, as well as dealing some decent damage, and it has quite a hefty cooldown being an ultimate, but you basically will become immune for 4 seconds and continually deal damage whilst you are immune, and then when it expires, it creates a big explosion for some nice damage as well. So this is a all-round great skill that has utility with freezing enemies and crowd control, as well as making yourself immune and dealing damage. It's kind of like the trifecta or perfect combination of everything that you want out of an ultimate. And then with that, you definitely are going to want to put a point into its synergies, which is when Deep Freeze ends, you get 10% of your base life as a barrier for 6 seconds, and that's for each enemy that you froze whilst it was active, which will be a lot, so that is a huge defense buff as well. And you can generally see this theme in the build where there are a lot of barriers and shields that you will have up, which will definitely give you that tanky feel and that good survivability in the end game. And all of these barriers, I think, will just add up to you really not struggling with staying alive in the later game. So then your next synergy here is Supreme Deep Freeze, and that is when Deep Freeze ends, your non-ultimate cooldowns are reduced by 50%. So that also gives you cooldown reduction on all those other defensive skills that you have that are all cooldown based. So lastly on our skill tree here, I skipped a section here, but we'll just go back to that now. You'll also take this node next to your ultimate, and that gives you a lot of damage and utility for your frost skills, which this build is based all around frost skills. So your first passive here within this skill node is frost skills deal 15% increased damage to elites, and that's with 3 hard ranks into that. The next one will give you 12% increased cold damage to vulnerable enemies, which a lot of your skills will create vulnerable enemies, and this is with 3 ranks into that. It will give you a 12% increase cold damage for these vulnerable enemies. Then looking at this passive, you will deal 9% increased damage to chilled enemies and 18% increased damage to frozen enemies. And like I showed you with Frost Nova and a couple of the other skills, like your Deep Freeze, there will be a lot of frozen enemies, and all your enemies will be chilled from your attacks anyway, so this is just a huge damage buff in general for your Frost skills. Then Frigid Breeze with 3 hard ranks into it. It increases your lucky hit chance against vulnerable enemies and has up to 20% chance to grant 15 mana. And that's just again playing into that regaining mana as much as you can within this build, so that you can spam Frozen Orbs as much as possible, and also playing into the amount of vulnerable enemies that you'll be creating. So that is your ultimate node here, ticked off and done for this Frozen Orb Sorcerer. Then lastly, on our passive skill tree here, or passive skill tree node, we will be picking up the Avalanche passive. And here it says that your lucky hits for your frost spells have up to a 10% chance to make your next cast of Ice Shards, Frozen Orb, or Blizzard, and obviously we're using Frozen Orb, and it will make it that your lucky hits have a 10% chance to consume no mana and deal 40% extra damage, and this chance is doubled against vulnerable enemies. So again, creating as many vulnerable enemies as possible, and with this passive you will be saving and conserving a lot of mana, as well as dealing a lot more extra damage. This skill passive is a no-brainer for this build. I mean, Shatter, we aren't creating as many frozen enemies as some other builds, so Avalanche is just your go-to for this. So that basically wraps up our skill tree here. There are these passives that we glanced over earlier, and what we want to do is get to Elemental Dominance, which means your core skills will deal 9% increased damage when cast above 50 mana. So a lot of the times you'll be dealing 9% increased damage with 3 ranks into this core passive here. And Devastation is just along the path that you need to get there, and that increases your maximum mana by 3. So in this build, we start off with your Frostbolt and its synergy, maxing out your Frozen Orb and its synergies, moving on to your defensive skills. Once you have some extra points, you'll put in these passive skills here. So you'll be using all of these defensive skills. For Conjuration, you'll use none of the Conjuration skills, but some of the passive skills that you have here to increase your damage and your defenses. Then you will be doing on the Mastery node here, Icy Veil and Snap Freeze. Moving on to your ultimates, you'll do Deep Freeze and its synergies, and all of these cold synergistic passive skills there. And then your main passive skill being Avalanche. So that is once you have reached level 50, and you should be completed with the campaign at this point in time. And with these skill points, excuse me, my mouth was getting a bit dry there, so a sip of wine will take care of that. This will be at level 50. You'll have all 60 of your points invested in the skill tree as shown. So all in all, I think this skill tree creates a very balanced character between pumping out a lot of damage with your Frozen Orbs at range, keeping you safe, and having a plethora of barriers and shields to keep you safe as well, with a lot of crowd control built into it with freezing and chilling enemies. And you will also be making a lot of enemies vulnerable, which in turn will increase your damage through a lot of the skills that we mentioned. So that is our skill tree for this pure Frozen Orb Sorcerer. And moving on from the skill tree, we will look at what aspects would best suit this build. So you will notice here in your skills that you have on your rotation in your skill bar that we don't have Frostbolt, your basic skill that generates your mana, in this rotation of skills on your skill bar. And the reason for that is some of the skills that we picked up that return and gain us mana in the skill tree, like for instance, if you have a look at your Ice Armor, and whilst Ice Armor is active, your mana regeneration is increased, various skills like that. Now, the main reason why you don't have a mana generating skill in this bar is because of this aspect, which is Prodigy's aspect, and we have a lot of cooldowns on our skill bar, and when we use a cooldown, we restore 15 to 25 mana. So you should be able to keep your mana topped up this way, as well as using other various nodes on your Paragon boards and the skills that we have put in. So that is why we don't necessarily need a basic mana generating skill on our skill bar. And there will be various ways that we can sort of negate the need for this mana generating skill. So looking at the skill bar here, we'll have our Frost Nova, Flame Shield, Ice Armor, Deep Freeze, your Teleport, and then your Frozen Orb. So looking at our Sorcerer specific mechanic here, which is Enchantments, the enchantments that we will pick up is our Frozen Orb enchantment, which means that whenever we cast a non-basic skill, so any of our cooldown skills and defensive skills, we will have a 20% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at nearby enemies. And this is just basically increasing our chance of dealing damage and pumping out more Frozen Orbs. And the next enchantment that we will pick up is removing our evade and replacing it with a short range teleport, and this has a 17-second cooldown, and this will just give us some extra mobility and utility within our build. I think there are some other enchantments you could pick up, but these are the ones that I would personally go for. Now, getting back to the aspects for this build, and these play a huge part in how powerful and survivable this build will be in the end game. So starting on the helm, or specifically, it doesn't really matter where these aspects are placed on your items, but just moving along how I have put it together here. So on our helm, we will have ever-living aspect, and that means that we take 20 to 25% less damage from crowd-controlled or vulnerable enemies, and again, we will be making a lot of enemies vulnerable, so this will give us a good damage mitigation buff. Then next we'll go to Exploiters aspect, and this aspect will give us 20% increased crowd control duration. While enemies are unstoppable, you deal 20 to 50% increased damage to them. So in the end game, a lot of the monsters and mobs that we fight will become unstoppable, so we'll be dealing a massive chunk of extra damage to them, as well as increasing our crowd control effects, which would be our chills and our frozen and all of that. So this is overall just a really great aspect to have on this build. Next up, we have Frozen Memories, which means the Avalanche key passive now applies to one additional cast. So this is using again that Avalanche main passive that we picked out, which is super powerful, and this will then apply to an extra cast as well, which is just a huge buff for this build in general. Next we have Aspect of Disobedience, and here we will gain 0.25 to 0.5% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 25 to 50%. So as we are pumping out our Frozen Orbs and our Frost damage, our damage will just be increasing, or sorry, not our damage, our armor will be increasing as we carry on doing our Frost damage, and this will again be a very good mitigation tool in the late game. Here on our boots we have the Aspect of Fortune, which increases our lucky hit chance by 10 to 20% whilst we have a barrier active. And like I showed you in the skill tree, we will basically always have multiple barriers active on this build. This build is very much focused around having barriers. On the weapon here, we have the Conceited aspect, which will deal 15 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. Again, we will always have barriers active, so this will play into that mechanic. Next, we have the Elementalist aspect, which means our core or mastery skills cast at above 100% mana gain a 20 to 40% increased critical strike chance, and spamming out our core skill of Frozen Orb, this will have a greatly increased critical strike chance, which would mean we deal a lot more damage. Then we talked about the Prodigies aspect, which will gain us our mana that we need back. The next, the aspect of Frozen Orbit, and I think this is sort of one of the key aspects, and probably one of the biggest ones, that this build revolves around, and that is that Frozen Orb stays in place after reaching its destination and explodes 2 additional times for 20 to 30% of its damage. So once we pump out our Frozen Orbs, there's a big chance that it stays in place, dealing a lot, or not a chance that it stays in place, it will stay in place and then deal a lot more damage with 2 additional explosions. And I think this is firstly just going to be visually awesome on the screen. It's going to look fantastic, but also just pump up our Frozen Orb damage immensely and exponentially. This is just such a powerful aspect for this build, and one that I recommend finding as soon as possible. So, lastly but not least is our Edge Masters aspect, and this means that skills deal up to 10 to 20% increased damage based on your available primary resource when you cast. So this will receive the maximum benefit when you are at full primary resource. So it won't be all that often that we are getting the 20% bonus, but at least we will be getting a 10+% bonus to our damage most of the time. So this is again just a big damage buff to our character. So that in a nutshell is our skill tree, which we have looked at, and our aspects. Now I won't go into items in specific because I think this will change based on what you find and where you are in the game, so I won't really be going into the items for this. But what we will look at just very briefly is the Paragon Board. And while this board is hugely important to your build, I think that everyone will have slight variations and differences on how they specifically spec their Paragon board for any build. I think it's one of the mechanics in the game that allows for the player to really customize and make their character their own, and also depending on what the character has at what point in time and what you find, what your luck and RNG is. And generally I think this will be sort of personalized and customized to each individual player. That's why I won't go into any detail about what you pick specifically on this Paragon board and how you get there. What you're going to want to do is make your way to as many glyph sockets as possible to insert powerful glyphs into our Paragon board, and this we will find in the end game of Diablo 4. And we'll also want to make our way to these legendary nodes, which are basically what we are going to base our Paragon board around. So this legendary node, for instance, is Frigid Fate, and this means that dealing cold damage to vulnerable enemies increases your lucky hit chance by 1% for 5 seconds, stacking up to 15% in total. So again, playing into the skill choices we made, this lucky hit chance will just increase our power by quite a substantial amount, and that is one of the legendary nodes that I would focus on going after. And in addition to that, another very important legendary node that we will look at is the Icefall node, and this means that killing a frozen enemy grants you up to 15% of your maximum life as a barrier for 5 seconds. Now, with all the skills that we have put into our skill tree, we will have frozen enemies quite often, and this will mean that we will get a very powerful defensive stat from our Paragon board, and this legendary node will just really buff up your defenses and make you a super tank in the end game. So that's an important node to pick up as soon as you can. And generally, whilst you're moving around the Paragon board here, you will rotate these boards to give you the shortest distance or path to reach the nodes you are looking for, which are the rare nodes, the glyph sockets, as well as these legendary nodes, as I mentioned. So guys, that will basically wrap up this video on the pure Frozen Orb Sorcerer and the build guide that I've created. I think this will be a fantastic build in both the early, mid, and end game, and it has that nice balance between being really tanky and dealing a lot of damage at the same time. I think that you should definitely consider this as one of your starting builds for the upcoming game release, and in addition to this, I'll also be adding a Lightning Sorceress build in the coming days now to give you another alternative to this pure Frozen Orb build, so you can catch that on the channel coming up very soon. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it insightful, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. We would really appreciate that, and we'll see you soon in the next one. Cheers.